First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank all of the presenters that have done the pre-recordings and more specifically the panelists that have joined us today. We're coming from all different parts with regards to geography. I know that it's either very early in the morning for some or very late at night for others, and I appreciate you taking the time in talking with us today on really some of the legislative hurdles and potentially opportunities that we could explore. So my name is Marco Schito. Just by way of introduction, I'm the Executive Director of the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory. This is a public-private partnership in collaboration with FDA. We are funded solely by FDA. And work very closely with the Cure ID platform that they've developed, and hopefully we will hear a little bit more about that in this discussion topic. We also work very closely with the NIH, primarily the Centers for the NCATS, sorry. Group at NIH, also interested in drug repurposing and working closely with their effort. They are a partner with Cure ID as well. They lead and sort of address a lot of the applications for the database. And then just to give you a little bit of background on the Critical Path Institute, which is where CDRC sits. We are a nonprofit organization based in Tucson, Arizona, and have been working in this sort of intersection between regulatory science and regulators and industry based on the needs of patient populations that are struggling, especially for drug development and COAs. So I think the main sort of driving force for this collaboratory is in its name. It is looking at capturing real world data in order to generate hypotheses on efficacy of using existing drugs for new indications. And we want to try to look at a wide variety of different sort of data sets and data points. We're more interested in real world data from not just clinician submitted reports, but also interested in electronic health records and registries and other data sources as well. And then to be able to capture, synthesize, sort of aggregate and synthesize real world evidence in order to help supplement an RCT, for example, to inform drug trials, as well as for potential for regulatory considerations in the future. So I know that this is a fairly large panel. I did want to ensure that everyone gets an opportunity, a couple minutes to talk about who they are, what their interest is, and I know that several of us have also recorded a presentation. My presentation that I recorded was primarily giving a little bit of an update on what this group can do and what may result from it. If you're interested in participating and having some further discussions, as we obviously would want to invite you. The whole point of this is to bring in a lot of different stakeholder viewpoints. So if this is of interest, I'm happy to have you join either work groups or teams in order to explore this this a little bit further. But for now, I'll pause and I'll head it over to David Simon, who's the main moderator of the session.
Hi, thanks, Marco. My name is David Simon. I'm a research fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School, and researching mainly digital health technologies and drug repurposing.
Great. Let's go through our panelists, and we'll just go from top to bottom. Jonathan. I don't know if Jonathan is on.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Yeah, I can hear you now.
All right. And I'm not sure if you can see me, but I'm Jonathan Darrow. I'm from Harvard Medical School and Bentley University, where I focus primarily on issues of the regulation of drug effectiveness and the communication of that effectiveness to patients, such as through labeling or advertisements.
Great. John Liddicoat?
Thanks. I'm John Liddicoat. I'm a senior research associate at the University of Cambridge in the law faculty. I primarily research intellectual property related issues, and for the past few years I've been concentrating on repurposing and taking various doctrinal and empirical approaches to researching the issue and looking for solutions.
Great, great. And if you haven't seen John's presentation, I highly recommend it. It was a great talk that you gave. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Sandeep?
Hi everyone, I'm Sandeep Bagowal. I'm a hematologist oncologist at the FDA in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. I'm a team lead on one of our genitourinary malignancies team, but I'm also the clinical lead for an initiative here that we call Project Renewal. It's a public health initiative to update older oncology drug labels. It's not exactly drug repurposing, but there are certainly some parallels there. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Great, thanks, Sandeep. And yes, that's another aspect of that we'll hopefully get into a little bit further is Project Renewal. But thanks for providing that presentation. It was a great overview on what's going on at the FDA and how that can help. Daniel?
Hey, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. I'm Dan O'Connor. I work as a medical assessor in the MHRA, which is the UK Medicines Drug Authority. And I'm interested in how regulators can support repurposing, particularly for those in the not-for-profit or patient organization setting. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. And a powerhouse on drug repurposing. You've been at this for quite a while, so thank you for joining us and taking the time. And great presentation as well, by the way. Lydia.
Lydia Meehuis, I'm the Managing Director of the Anti-Cancer Fund. The Anti-Cancer Fund is a Belgian research foundation, but working internationally. And we have two main pillars. One is on supporting non-commercial clinical research, and the other one is on providing individual information to patients regarding their treatment options. If I have to pitch our organization, we are driven by patients, guided by science, and powered by donations. And we also involve in policy work when it serves our activities. Thank you for inviting me.
No, great. Thanks, Lydia. And it's great to have another nonprofit and that our missions sort of align very well. So I'm looking forward to future conversations and discussions. You've been a great help in pulling a lot of this together, and thanks for your presentation on how nonprofits can be more involved in this effort. Heather.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Heather Stone. I'm in the Office of Medical Policy and FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research as well, where I lead the Cure ID program with my collaborators at FDA and at NCATS, and now in partnership with CPATH with Marco at the CDRC. We're really delighted to be having this conversation, so thank you all for participating. I think as Daniel rightly said, a question of how can a regulator support repurposing, particularly for areas of high unmet medical need and where there may be an opportunity for nonprofits and sort of atypical drug developers to play a role in this space. So really looking forward to an engaging discussion, and thanks for your participation.
Thanks, Heather, as always. Predita.
Hello, everyone. I'm Predita TaylorZapata. I am a program official at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, specifically in the obstetric and pediatric pharmacology and therapeutics branch, long name. But as you can tell, we sort of do research in pharmacology, both in the maternal space, the fetal space, and the pediatric space. One of our mandates that we are responsible for implementing is the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act program at the NIH. And we sort of make sure we prioritize drugs that need to be studied. We fund studies through the Pediatric Trials Network, and these are primarily off-patent studies that we fund as well. And then we submit those data to the FDA for label change. So privileged to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Predita. And now there's a series of groups that that we're able to, and I'm really very happy to be able to introduce as well, that have joined us for this session and have expressed interest to pursue additional discussions. And it's a pleasure to introduce Nitin Bagowal. Nitin.
Yes, thanks, Marco. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Canberra, Australia in the early morning. Similar to what Dan and Sandeep and Heather said, my role today is to understand what the regulatory hurdles are. And we've been working on repurposing medicine for last 1 year, having a lot of consultations externally and also stakeholder management. The key driver we are looked into is, as I said, the regulatory hurdles, but also the reimbursement hurdles. So looking at from both the angles to understand where the atypical sponsors or academic sponsors can be helped to understand how we can help to not only explain them how we go about it, but also be hand-holding to submissions and evaluations and reimbursement part as well. So thank you very much. I'm glad to be here to discuss this.
Thank you very much, Nitin. And next is Cesar.
Good evening to everyone from Spain. My name is Cesar Hernandez. I'm a rheumatologist training. I have been in the regulatory.
Cesar, you're breaking up quite a bit. I think Cesar, you're having some bandwidth issues. Yeah, maybe keeping your camera off may help. Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. I'm here because I'm the head of the Department of Medicines for Human Use at the Spanish Agency, but also because I have the legacy of Dan in the repurposing group in Europe that is trying to test whether the current legislative framework is able to cope with the repurposing, or if we need changes in the legislation to allow this kind of developments. And happy to be here. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar. Momir.
Momir Radulovic. I'm the Executive Director of Slovenian Medicines and Medical Device Agency, and Slovenia took over the rotating 6 months presidency of the Council of the EU. And in the field of pharmaceuticals, we put one point of improving accessibility to and availability of medicines, especially where there is a lack of commercial interest. And we saw antibiotics and drug repurposing. So we want to make legislation that supports repurposing efforts also in cases where there is no direct commercial interest, and even more would like to have also non-for-profit research and actually to cover end-to-end, so even not for-profit production facilities at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Momir, and I'll also mention to the participants, if you have a chance to listen to Lydia's talk, who really provides a lot of background that both Cesar and Momir have done in the EU to sort of streamline and push the agenda on that aspect of drug repurposing. So thank you, and we'll be touching base obviously during this this panel discussion on many of those topics. And then finally, Agnes.
It's good afternoon, everybody. I'm quite happy to be here. I am the Senior Medical Advisor in our Director General's office. Previously I was a review center director. This is sort of a semi-retirement, let's say, activities for me. I have been involved for many years in all sorts of pediatric and rare diseases issues in our regulatory agency in Health Canada. I now belong to the Biologics and and Biologic and Radiopharmaceuticals Drug Directorate. Previously, I did also pharmaceuticals, so I've been at this for 40 years or just over 40 years. I have sort of tried to push the pediatric agenda forward, but until there was what I would call a general will to reform the entire regulatory system that we have, which is really going ahead with and adding the lessons learned from COVID, and we call it Agile Regulations. That has brought in a much more formalized way policies around rare diseases and policies around pediatrics in general. They're in our policy section. If somebody is looking after that portion, and the work on taking the whole thing to a regulatory framework is ongoing. I don't know what the timeline is exactly, because we're not at that stage. It's still at the very policy stage, but there's consultations ongoing as we go along. One of the issues was the question of reimbursement of drugs that would be quite costly for rare diseases, and as such, portions of our ministry that have got some influence on the and say in how or setting up a process for reimbursement are now also on board. So I think that things will happen over the next period of time. That said, our authority is kind of quite well circumscribed to what we as a regulator can do, but we have some influence in influencing the direction of what the entire policy piece will be going to.
Thanks, Agnes, and we hope to actually get into some of those reimbursement issues as well, because this is always an important topic for some drugs, right? And that's another sort of aspect for this to discuss. Why don't I just take the time just to thank again. I guess there's the Project Renewal presentation, as well as the ILAP presentation from MHRA. Sandeep or Daniel, would you like to just summarize, maybe a very high level, of what those projects are, how they came to be, and the impact that you're hoping that they can have, or that they are having?
Happy to.
Now, I'll start with you, I guess, Dan. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I jumped in there. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's great to see all of this expertise on this panel. So thanks for getting us together, and it's hopefully we'll get some really great ideas that we can share. So the ILAP, which is called the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway, was launched at the beginning of this year, and it's not solely for repurposing drugs, but we do specifically call out repurposing drugs. And it's a unique partnership, and I think, as Agnes has mentioned, it's really important not only to think about the licensing, so the drug approval process, but also thinking about, is someone going to pay for that medicine? Because really, when we think about an end-to-end approach in terms of patient access, clearly we need the clinical data, either from clinical trials or from real-world data. And we know that many repurposed products have much real-world data that we can use to help with the licensing decisions. But really what we wanted to achieve with the ILAP was a unique platform, and to have that platform for multi-stakeholder discussions to really try to drive that repurposing. So there's a designation step, it's called the Innovation Passport, and this has a component of repurposing. So it has a subpart to it, which is open to both commercial and non-commercial sponsors, but also companies who are repurposing can tick the criteria around developing a medicine in a significant clinical new indication. So repurposing is certainly called out, and we call it out in terms of our guidance. And then the idea is that either the company or the sponsor, the not-for-profit, will then use a process called the Target Development Profile Roadmap to further develop their product and create a licensable product. But it's not only licensable, so it's kind of access ready. So it's considered both the regulatory authority and the HTA bodies, because the HTA bodies in the UK are key partners in terms of the delivery of the ILAP. So far, we haven't had any experience in what you might traditionally class as repurposing, those really older products, the ones that already have generic substitutions, but we've certainly had interest from companies that are developing new indications. But so far, these new indications are for those innovator companies that still hold some form of IP protection on the product. But interestingly, we have had some early discussions with patient groups who are pretty interested about putting some of their molecules through to the ILAP. And so we hope over time that we'll get some experience for the not-for-profit organizations as well in some of those really key areas of repurposing. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And then you've also developed these tools, right, that go along with it, that can help many of these groups, especially the nonprofits and the groups that may not have the expertise and have really come into the regulatory sphere as much as some of the, for example, the for-profit companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really key, isn't it? I think in terms of ensuring that you're driving efficiencies in the data collection, that you're ensuring that data collection is regulatory and access ready, but also thinking about a continuous benefit risk approach to that data. And how can we really integrate real world evidence in terms of supporting the data that already exists? And it's, as you've mentioned, it's particularly important for those that are maybe either the smaller companies or the not-for-profit organizations, because these organizations don't have large regulatory affairs companies. They don't have the kind of experience. And some of the discussions that we have, you've got 5 people on the call and they literally say, this is everyone. This is the entire clinical development, the regulatory, the HTA, the everything. So having these very visible pathways, I think, can be really helpful in terms of supporting those that are doing repurposing, where there may not be the kind of normal levels of knowledge or infrastructure that can help get things through quickly to market and to the patient.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for that additional information. Actually, before I go to Sandeep, I was going to go to Momir because I think that this sort of dovetails nicely what you've been trying to do. And the nice thing that I hear from Dan is that you have both commercial and non-commercial groups coming in. And any thought on your aspect of the work that you're trying to push forward? And I think the press release went out maybe a couple of weeks ago now on the EMA sort of pilot project.
So the pilot project that was done by Dan and Cesar, so definitely this fundamental work was done by STEM group. This was approved and it's ongoing, and this needs to be now tested. This framework will be tested, and we all hope that we will come. This will also be used as assessment how to change the legislation. So I think we all agree that we have lower costs of development, we have lower risk of failure, and we have reduced time of authorization. And that these 3 key things we need to incorporate in the legislation change in order to make it happen.
Thank you. Cesar, did you have anything else to add to that?
Sorry, and apologies because the connection seems to be very unstable, and I'm going to connect the camera. But I mean, as Momir have said, what we are trying to do is to test whether some developments for all products, so out of the protection period, that are available in the market, and that the academia is making clinical trials or are leading registries or so on, to see whether this data can be used for the regulatory purposes, building on the structures that we already have in place. So, I mean, the innovation offices at the national level, or the innovation task force at the EMA level, and then to guide the non-for-profit organizations that we term champions to the scientific advice, so we can support how to gather all this data. So in the end, we can make a regulatory decision that is finally put at the disposition of the industry, the companies. I mean, most of this product would be in the generic sector, so many companies can take advantage of this framework if it really works. I mean, we were about to be honest, we were about to launch the pilot before the pandemic. I mean, my last travel before the pandemic was to kind of presentation in Brussels of this project. And 1 week after, we were in the lockdown, and and the experience, the pilot was put on hold. But to be honest, if we also build on the COVID-19 experience, and we see, for example, the example of the dexamethasone is pretty much the same. I mean, academic or hospitals or not-for-profit organization gathering the data to prove that an oral medicine is useful for a given indication, and then to make possible that the companies, through very easy procedures, regulatory procedures, can use this indication for the process. I think it's important not only for the patient, because we may argue that off-label use is possible, but for the protection of that product. I mean, these products. I mean, really, it is worthwhile that we really include in the label all the possible values of the product, and I think for that is important. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Cesar. That's great, and you know, I can see that all of these, both the ILAR and this effort from STAMP, is going to, you know, you put a lot of effort in there to make sure that that you have resources there for those groups that are coming in. I think that's going to be important. It's great vision to be able to know that that's going to be there, but it's also going to take resources, so both human and other. So I'm glad that there is that effort moving forward. I guess from the FDA side, we have Project Renewal, again, not a particularly focused on drug repurposing per se, but it has an element in it, as Sandeep had mentioned earlier. Sandeep, do you want to give maybe a couple minute sort of summary on that?
Sure. Thanks, Marco. So Project Renewal is an initiative within the Oncology Center of Excellence, which is a center here at the FDA that coordinates various aspects of regulatory science as it pertains to oncology across different centers and coordinates them. The point of it is to update older oncology drug labels. These are drugs that have been off patent and often have decades of experience, decades of use. The labels are just like woefully out of date. Some of them haven't been updated since the 70s or the 80s. They're not even in the current format, so they can often be unreadable. So in updating them, you know, there's one aspect which is just updating the format, but we also are updating the content, and that includes adding indications, updating to contemporary dosing, and aspects that may pertain to specific populations like pediatrics, geriatrics, etc. What we do is, you know, the project does depend on the voluntary participation of sponsors. But on the FDA side, we do a lot of legwork here to evaluate the evidence that's available. There's often decades of experience with these drugs, so we have a lot of the data there. So, you know, what we do is we go and we find that data and we piece together our argument for why there is substantial evidence of effectiveness and adequate safety data for any changes that we're making. And then we go ahead and, you know, we've been working on a few labels now. We haven't gotten one through yet. This is still kind of an iterative process. We're still going through it, but the goal is to get a few of these labels updated within the next year. And the goal is really to allow for safe and effective use of these drugs, because they're still used as part of, predominantly these are chemotherapy, cytotoxic chemotherapy drugs. With a lot of the new drugs coming out now, immunotherapy and targeted agents, they're often added to a chemotherapy backbone. So these drugs are still being used and at the same doses and schedule often in these trials. So we think it's important to get those updated. So yeah, so we're going through the data, adding new indications. And again, these are off-patent drugs. The drugs have often been used for these indications for a very long time. And so the evidence is out there, but no one just ever put it together and put it in the label. And that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and that must be very resource intensive. I can imagine that there's a lot of work that's done. I know that you have consultants and groups that are pulled together, that there are meetings, but it's quite an effort to be able to do that. But I think it's worth it, right? It's as you said, they're still being used, and they're being used in different aspects of it. I was wondering, because you also work with the RLD holder. How's that been? How has that been basically? Do RLD holders really, sort of embrace this, saying, "Oh, this is great. I'd love to do this," or do you see the sort of like, "Oh, yeah, that's great," but
That's a good question. So far, we've had good luck in that the few we've reached out to have agreed to voluntarily participate. I can't think of one that has refused or had a negative spin on it. So that's been promising. But as we're going through getting some of our proposed changes back to the RLD holders, now we're kind of in the meat of it. So we're going to see how this process plays out. What we've tried to do to hopefully promote this participation is really try to reduce the burden on the RLD holders. So we do a lot of the legwork in looking at the data. We create summary documents with all the references and really kind of try to hand it to them on a platter, so to speak, because we really want to reduce any kind of obstacle or burden for them. We really want to enable voluntary participation. So far so good, but still kind of in the process of teasing out some of these aspects of the process. So we may learn a couple of things in the next few months as well.
Okay, and I see a question from Predita coming in, is that what tools or evidence are you using to propose those label changes or label updates? Are they systematic literature reviews, for example?
Oh, thank you for the question, Predita. So we're actually going right down to the clinical trial data. One difference is if we do, let's say, a contemporary drug review, we have the data sets and the patient level data that we're going through to confirm sponsor findings and claims. Here, we don't have that patient level data, but we are obtaining the manuscripts. When we can, we reach out and get the actual protocol and statistical analysis plan for some of these trials. What we look for are ideally, we want well controlled and adequate trials as per our regulations, the CFR. That hasn't changed. In some cases, we will have that nice pivotal phase 3 randomized clinical trial. In other cases, particularly those with rare disease, or many years ago, where the standards for how clinical trial conduct was in oncology is a bit different, we get down into the protocol and the statistical analysis plan, and we try to determine whether the study is adequate and well controlled to support an update to the label. So if there's a drug that's being used, let's say in lung cancer for 20 or 30 years, we'll go and find all the references, and from there, try to get the protocols and try to see, was multiplicity accounted for to avoid false positive findings? What was the primary endpoint and was that met? What were the safety findings? What was the exact patient population enrolled, eligibility criteria. So we really try to treat it like we would a contemporary drug review, but the difference is we don't have that patient level data. So we are reliant upon the literature, but the data source is still, we're still looking for substantial evidence of effectiveness as we would in a contemporary drug review.
And do you would you consider real world data to be able to supplement that level of data review, or is it that you're just really are looking at the current published reports?
So for this initiative, we have not used real world data. There are some other efforts ongoing within the Oncology Center of Excellence for that. And we've tried to maintain some separation between this and some of the other more contemporary projects to avoid some issues there. So here we are predominantly just looking at these clinical trial data from the past. Real world data is kind of having its own effort. And yeah, we haven't yet combined these two. And a lot of the drugs we're looking at, these are quite old. So there was less of that available regardless. So we've kept them apart thus far.
Okay. And then sort of I'll switch it over to my the group at OMP at FDA. Heather, do you want to sort of give a little bit of an update on over the past, I guess, decade, the work that you and Leonard have been doing on drug repurposing and using real world data.
Sure. Thanks, Marco. Yeah, so about 10 years ago, Leonard Sachs and I got together to work on a project about how we could capture case reports directly from clinicians of how they were using drugs off label. And the really fundamental question was, what could we, as regulators working in policy, do to facilitate drug development for areas of high unmet medical need? At that time, specifically focused on neglected tropical diseases and infectious diseases where there's just no interest from commercial sponsors in developing drugs for these populations because there's no return on investment. And the feeling was that there was data to be had that, clinicians were using drugs off label all the time to treat these patients because they had no other choices, but that nobody was ever collecting that information, and therefore we as a society or medical community couldn't learn from it. And that includes both the things that work, but also the things that don't work. So, people were continuously using the same things, either in the absence of evidence that they were effective, or in the absence of evidence that they were not effective. But either way, we're not able to make the most informed decisions for their patients. And so we created a platform to enable the collection of cases from around the world in a systematic fashion, trying to make it as easy as possible for healthcare providers really anywhere to contribute their case. So it's very high level. It's, the case report form takes sort of 3 to 10 minutes to enter. At its core, it's, what drug did you use? What disease did the patient have? How was it diagnosed? Why did you use that drug in a new way? What was the outcome and how was it determined? And were there any adverse events? We, of course, then, there's an optional section to delve into additional information about demographics and so forth. And then this all well predated the real world data, real world evidence phenomena, but it fits very much within that space. And, I think is potentially a source of real world data. This is how these drugs are being used in clinical practice by healthcare providers. It's being captured in a little bit of a unique way. So we have both a website as well as a mobile app, which is available, on a phone and offline and all of that kind of thing. So it's accessible globally. But I think the larger question then becomes, how does one translate that information from a sort of regulatory perspective? Obviously, from a public health perspective and clinical perspective, having any data is helpful, and even anecdotal reports can be informative, but there are obvious limitations. And we wanted to be careful that we weren't just sort of willy-nilly promoting that people, use drugs off label, as that was not the intention. The intention was to capture what they were already doing. But this led to the development of the CDRC, of this public-private partnership, where it was felt that, collectively the stakeholders could really examine how this end-to-end process that is being talked about of, how do you take a drug and move it from, in this case, the anecdotal data collection stage through an evidence generation process that would enable, for example, that information to be used to inform adequate and well-controlled clinical trials, and how that data collectively, both the clinical trial data, possibly with the supplement of the real-world data, could be used for regulatory decision-making. And then, this illuminated that one of the key challenges, I think, which is that in the US at least, there are not clear pathways available for non-traditional sponsors so it's the drug sponsor who owns the label, and therefore it requires their participation and consent for the label to be updated, except for safety findings. And so in the event of an off-patent drug where the reference listed drug holder may not exist anymore, or even where they do exist, but they're not interested, or anything else, it can be difficult, if not impossible, to update the label. And so this has led us to try to understand this challenge and to understand how big of a problem it is, you know, and to then look at what other regulatory authorities are doing. Interestingly, this issue seems to be sort of going around the globe, and all of the regulatory authorities are simultaneously trying to address this issue and coming up with different solutions. And so understanding what our fellow regulators are trying and whether similar pathways might be possible as what this legislative policy and regulatory group is sort of focused on within CDRC.
Thanks, Heather. That was nicely done. It's a tour de force of the work that's been going on there. And I wanted to turn it over to Nitin and to hear, sort of based on some of the aspects that we've been talking about here, and potentially some of the work that I know that it's very early stages in Australia. But any thoughts about those discussions and how you know, the efforts that have been going on in other parts of the world, how that can be shaping or at least molding the conversations?
Yeah, thanks, Marco. I think so. We have been, as I said in my introduction, that we've been working on this for at least a year or slightly more than a year. And then how we went about was to, you know, again, Heather was also a key driver of this. Last time we had our over to TGA to do a presentation on how QRID is working on it, and also help to understand what the landscape is and how we can adapt that learnings into TGA's work on regulatory hurdles. But also we work very closely on being a part of the Department of Health overall with our reimbursement colleagues to understand, like as Dan saying, end-to-end process, rather than just sticking to our own ways and thinking that this will go ahead without the reimbursement piece. So we are at the moment, as I said, a working document where we are trying to understand what are the proactively, you know, working around identifying the suitable candidates for evaluation of for repurposing. And we're also developing what we call a support towards regulatory and reimbursement applications, including coalition of clinical evidence, literature reviews, sourcing reviews from comparable versus regulators, and health technology assessments. We also want to create a priority review for these evaluations to say that, you know, that means it gives the confidence to the applicants or sponsors that we are into it for a real reason rather than doing a standard pathway. We are also thinking of whether we can waive or reduce the application and the evaluation fees to where there is a no commercial, you know, incentives to do that. We're also trying to see whether we can, again, this is all in a nebulous stage, to understand whether regulatory exclusivity can be given for limited period for sponsors for repurposed indications. So these are all, as I said, multiple, toolkits we are trying to manipulate to a certain extent where there is a real unmet clinical need, and take it from there. So it's as I said, we still don't have a very robust approach to what criteria we'll create to see whether what can be repurposed and how we can do it. Should we do it as a pilot program for first year and then take the learnings from them to make it as a full-flown program? But again, as I said, these are the few ideas floating around, and few have been accepted and few are still under consideration.
Thanks, Nitin. And you know, this is another aspect of this, is that you know, although we're talking about, you know, very discrete individual pilot programs or projects, it really does, I think, require a much broader overview of all the incentives to be able to shape the policies in such a way to ensure that you're having the right effect coming out, and something that that we'll eventually be talking about a little bit, you know, a little bit more later on this. I did see a couple of questions coming through in the chat. And that was, I think, in regards to the citizens petition for FDA, and I think Heather, do you want to sort of provide a little bit of thought on that?
Sure. So like I said in the chat, this is not my area of expertise, so take this with a grain of salt. And if anyone has more expertise in this space and can contribute, please feel free to do so. But as I understand it, yes, a public interest group or an academic can submit a citizen petition. I think it's more commonly done for safety than for efficacy. But for efficacy, it requires the participation of the reference listed drug holder. So if you notice what you heard from Sandeep, as well as what we heard from Predita this morning and in her introduction, both of those programs, which are the FDA's two major examples of where there has been some effort to update the drug labels by parties other than the drug sponsor, they both rely on the drug sponsor being willing to update the label. They don't do it in the absence, or at least now they don't do it in the absence of the reference listed drug holders sort of consent and willingness to participate. And so, I believe it fundamentally comes down to the fact that the drug sponsor owns the label. I mean, FDA can obviously dictate to a degree what the label says, but it's fundamentally owned by the drug sponsor. And so again, with the exception of safety, can't dictate that they add a new indication if they don't want to. So, but I don't know, Jonathan, if you have more experience. I'm not at all informed about citizen petitions, so it may be that there is a pathway that I'm not aware of, and would love to hear about that if you think that's the case.
That sounds exactly right. And I guess no one, as I understand it, no one is proposing to cut the RLD holder out of the pathway. Are they? I mean, I think that would introduce some problems that are not, of incentives and willingness of the RLD holder to engage in the first place. So I guess what I'm saying is, it seems to me that there already is a pathway. It's not so much that the pathway is the problem, it's that it's difficult to do it because the RLD holder is involved and is going to be involved, and it would be difficult to make them not involved.
I think that there are lots of different philosophies on how to do this. I think that there has been consideration by some parties about whether there would be a way to do this in the absence of the reference listed drug holder. Again, not so much because one wants to cut them out, but because there are instances in which they no longer exist. And so it doesn't solve that problem. And for some therapeutic areas, that's much more of a problem than for others. But certainly in the space of antibiotics, which is what I primarily work on, many of the drugs are 40 plus years old, and the RLD holders are not necessarily in existence any longer. So I think that that's certainly on the far end of the spectrum of what people are considering, and the efforts that have gone through the reference listed drug holder are the ones that have been able to be implemented, at least in pilot stages thus far. And so that is certainly the more obvious direction to take, but it doesn't completely solve the problem, though it probably gets you, 80+% of the way there. But as you say, it introduces a whole host of other different problems.
So I was actually noticing, I was reading a little bit of that, Jonathan, and after you suggested that in your presentation, and it says it requires a secretary to actually be aware of the process, and so it's not just an FDA thing, but it's actually the secretary, just secretary, that comes in and says, yes, we need to look at this. And that's why I think most of the time it's usually on safety issues more than anything else that moves forward with.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That pathway has been used for safety far more than for efficacy, but I have not found anything that would prevent it from being used for efficacy. The statute seems to allow that. I mean, it seems in part that people aren't aware that it can be used for that, including people within the FDA.
I think that there's been a lot of internal debate about whether it can or cannot be used, and amongst the legal professionals and policymakers within the FDA. I think it is, the last I had heard about it was that it was unclear, whether it had just never been used but could be used for efficacy versus had never been used because it cannot be used for efficacy was not totally clear. But again, you were probably more of an expert on this issue than I am. So
really, there's only one way to find out whether it can be used or can't be used, which is to use it and see what happens.
I was just gonna, there's a lot of chats coming in, and please, people, feel free to jump in. Predita, I think that you had a comment here as well.
It was just a follow-up to Heather's comment about if no RLD registered drug holder exists, that who do you negotiate with? And in our experience, it's actually the Office of Generics. So there's always someone to negotiate with if you want to change the label.
Really? Huh. See, I learned something from you every time we talk, Predita.
Well, I think in Canada, the process would be much the same. And we have some examples where the originator was no longer in existence, and a modification to the label was necessary, and there was representation from academic centers and universities that they really needed the drug for whatever purpose. So they ended up by negotiating with one of the generics to sort of pull the file together and get something going. That was in one instance. I mean, there are many little wrinkles to that. In another instance, they came to us and they said, can you help us sponsor a workshop so that we can pull the information together and file it through the generic pharmaceutical that is willing to do it, but they don't have the means, and because it was a really tiny company who was willing to make this happen, but didn't have the wherewithal, and so there was some kind of a combined funding. I think we kind of nominally sponsored it, and sort of, our Institute of Health Research funded it in part, and the whole information was pulled together. We cannot kind of mandate efficacy data. We can mandate safety data, which is kind of addresses the issue of, a citizen's petition is usually safety related. Although I don't know whether when 1 milligram aspirin went on the market in the US, whether that didn't have both safety and efficacy data. It was a full package kind of thing. It was a very interesting full package because I listened through the entire process on that one. That was, I would say in the mid to late 80s. So you might want to have a look at that and see how that went through and whether there was any efficacy there, Heather. I don't know. I don't remember. I know there was efficacy data, but I don't know what the basis, the actual basis. I don't remember the actual basis for the citizen petition was.
Something for us to look into.
I think it's worthwhile looking into it because one could kind of see if something like that is feasible. I mean, we don't have the process of citizen petition, but we've gotten around it in many other ways. And the Institute of Health Research, and we cannot solicit to add new indications. Simply just, it won't work. So our Institute for Health Research, has sometimes jumped in the breach in different ways by sort of using their intermediate services to kind of make sure that information flows in when it was necessary. So there are ways, and we've sort of looked at those options. We don't have, you know, the only thing we can really do is in terms of incentives is, or really is having a fee mitigation moves. And that's possible now, and that's the first reform that's in place, because our fees were tied to financial thing, and now they've moved into the drug regulation area, so we have much more flexibility of shaping it. So if there is a need for shaping it, it's feasible, you know, but where the priority lies in the middle of all the priorities is something that you have to always consider. And so there are sort of those other ways. And I think the same thing, you know, we've now have the authority to mandate safety studies even, which we didn't have and we've been wanting for a long time. So all of those kind of updates have already happened. And now there is this, what we call Agile Regulations, which is in the process of incorporating the learnings from COVID.
Actually,
Same
now
way as the
talking,
FDA, same as the FDA, in the
so
process of incorporating all of those learnings into the thing. And the really nice thing is that there is a will now to kind of make happen both orphan drugs and pediatric, a major
pediatric drugs,
pediatric
right?
initiative, because we didn't have any regulations, and so you can start begging all you want about pediatrics unless you have the stick, you know, the famous stick, the
Right,
carrot
which is
alone, the
which is what
carrot
FDA
alone.
has. It says the BPCA, and then it has now I'm blanking. Yeah, the PREA, right? So there's a stick and a carrot there. So so that's exactly that. But I did see a note from Lydia about you know, maybe we could start taking a look at what has happened over the past 18 months because of COVID. And a lot of the pressures that really have been put on the regulatory agencies, not only EMA but FDA and around the world, to assess some level of evidence on certain drugs that are being touted as being something that would be important. That dexamethasone is something that was positive, but we also have you know, areas where there are some concerns with the sort of the current thinking. So Heather, I think that you wanted to address this.
Yeah, no, thank you, Marco. I just I think that Lydia's comment was really timely and is a great example for ways to kind of think through the details. So, you know, dexamethasone, obviously one trial, the recovery study in the UK, really changed clinical practice by demonstrating, you know, a substantial mortality benefit in severely ill COVID patients. And the FDA and EMA have gone forward in different ways. So obviously with the FDA, we have the emergency use authorizations, but for the reasons that we've just talked about, you know, dexamethasone is not approved by FDA for the treatment of patients with COVID-19. And it sounds like Lydia was mentioning that there was an interesting approach that was taken by the EMA to have it be evaluated. So Lydia, maybe if you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit about that, or to our other European colleagues.
Yeah. Well, I'm not the expert, but how we perceived it is because also during a webinar on drug repurposing, we actually asked the EMA representative about how they were going to deal with that pressure and that issue. And then it was announced that indeed they had to find a solution. And what they used was the Article 5.3, and as it was said before, that is normally used for pharmacovigilance and for safety issues. But actually, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mumi or Cesar, is that that it's an opinion of the EMA on an assessment of the data that were out there. And it was actually the CEO at the time, Rossi, who really forced that pathway for the time being at that time. But then afterwards, if you now look at the expansion of the authority of EMA as a consequence of COVID, we have what is called HERA. It's kind of the emergency response authority that they will install in Europe. And there, EMA, in case of a pandemic, will be allowed again to kind of assess all clinical data out there without having an application from the market authorization holder. But I've asked the question to Emma Cook if that really only accounts for pandemics, and for the time being, that's what it is. So maybe we could think of expanding that to where there's big unmet needs of, maybe that could be a way forward. And I'm happy to hear the opinion of the regulatory people on that thinking. If it can be done for a pandemic, why not for where there's big unmet need or for pediatric cases?
Mounir or Cesar?
Yes, if I may comment on this. Yeah, I fully agree with what Lydia has said. I think that if this can be used during the pandemic, it should be used in out of this crisis situation for other purposes. In the meantime, during the pandemic, we didn't launch the pilot project, but we maintain our meetings with the champion representative and the industry representative, and we managed to analyze through surveys the experience of the companies, for example, including on-label the opinion based on the Article 5.3 that Lydia has mentioned. And I mean, although we, to be honest, we didn't get as much responses as we expected, but it was a small sample but representative. And to be honest, it is quite simple. If we have a scientific opinion, I mean, maybe we need a legislative change to establish this. But if we have a scientific opinion at the EU level, for example, it is not that difficult that the companies include on label in the products that they have. It doesn't matter if are approved by the centralized procedure for the entire European Union or if they are products that are approved by the national procedure. So the problem and the barriers could be, and I think we need to discuss this in Europe and probably elsewhere, is what is beyond that approval. I mean, if companies beyond that approval feel that the price is going to go down once they add a new indication, it's going to be a problem because I mean the small interest that they may have, because it is not an additional charge for them to include this on label. But if the pricing system make the price go down, it's going to be difficult to support this. And maybe I have a last comment on this because I wanted to intervene previously. Another problem that we need to solve is, okay, what can we do if we have the evidence and for efficacy or safety, and the companies, even one company, no company wants to get the label on label. So, I mean, can we do something? Can we make kind of expression? For example, in Spain, we have a kind of recommendations that is made by the agency, and we can make recommendations for use and no use in off-label cases. For sure, recommendations for non-use are based on safety issues or clearly non-efficacy of the drug. But maybe we can use this also to, I mean, it doesn't matter if the company.
Yeah, I think that's a great thought, Cesar, and I and others that I've talked to have been sort of thinking about the same way of saying, you know, we have a mechanism. It's very robust. It's very thorough, but it requires an RLD holder or the sponsor to actually sign off on it. But the whole point of that is to get something on label. But in cases where the drug is probably it's on patent, but the potential of that sponsor doesn't necessarily want that drug for whatever reason, because maybe it's for a rare disease or a variety of different things. We don't necessarily have to go down that road, but they don't necessarily want to be able to actually put that on their label. Then is there another potential way where we can sort of show that the process has been complete, from the fact that it's safe, it's effective, but so that it at least provides the information to prescribers. It allows patients to be a little bit more comfortable in taking a particular drug, but not necessarily. And that's who's really going to be benefiting from this. And then the drug will still be available. The only challenge on this is reimbursement that I see.
I mean, Marco, the way that usually happens is through the dissemination of peer-reviewed journal articles and medical guidelines. So I think that getting rid of the RLD holder, I think, is going to be a bigger challenge. I just wanted to follow up to what Heather had mentioned earlier, which I thought, again, was exactly correct. And the statute is potentially ambiguous, which is why it's so important for the FDA to interpret it in a way that allows efficacy to be included within the statute. And that's because if it were ever challenged in court, there's something called Chevron deference, where the court will defer to the agency's reasoned interpretation. But the first step is the agency has to interpret it that way. And I think you're right that the lawyers, one of whom we've talked to, is not certain that the statute allows it. So I'd be happy to write up the reasoned explanation if that would help, because I think it's there. I think it's very clear. And it would not be difficult for the FDA to argue that it is there, that the authority is there in the statute.
I think that's sort of how you interpret, or how courts or others interpret, or different legal opinion interpret sometimes the regulations, is a very tricky point, and I think we run into that quite regularly. So as a result, we have now what we call a decision guide, where it sort of tells us how to document everything in such a way that we can, if it should go to court, we sort of still can say that we have not sort of departed from what, and by really taking science and documenting it very meticulously. And I think we've made often the argument, at least I have made very often the argument, that if you don't have efficacy data, there is a safety issue. There's a huge safety issue.
And Jonathan, I'll just respond to that and just say that I think it also depends on the type of disease that we're looking at, especially for rare diseases. It's often difficult to really make guidelines that have sufficient level of evidence to be able to commit one way or the other. So I'm just thinking of ways in which we could use the existing infrastructure to be able to assist in doing that, and potentially using additional sort of data sources to come up with some of those decision making or decisions. I think that this is also a good time to start thinking about some of the things that have come up, for example, legislative challenges. And I think, David, you were talking a little bit about that, and this would be great to get John Lydicote in here as well, and Jonathan, you too, on some of those legislative potential opportunities, I guess, or areas that could be explored.
Yeah, so John Lydicote, maybe you want to talk a little bit about what's been happening over on the other side of the pond from us, and whether it's been successful. I know you've done some research about the effect of the +1, the addition of the exclusivity period for drug sponsors who add a new indication. I wonder if you could talk about that and sort of the general landscape over there.
Okay, so the I'll have to give a bit more of a background to the way regulatory protection works here when a drug is first authorized. When a drug is first authorized, let's say it's a new chemical entity, it receives straight away 8 years of data protection and 2 years and an extra 2 years market protection. So 8 plus 2 is 10. And then if that marketing authorization holder within the first 8 years repurposes that drug for a new indication, it receives an extra plus 1 year, so extending that 8 plus 2 plus 1 to 11. So that plus 1 was introduced with the idea of incentivizing more repurposing by reference drug holders. That was introduced, I might get my dates wrong, so perhaps the EMA people can correct me, but I think it was introduced in 2004 legislation and then came into effect in 2006. And so the EMA existed for about 11 years before that and 14 years after, or at least 14 years after, before I started analyzing how the plus 1 worked. So I analyzed it, looking at data, I think up until about 2020. And the idea was to see if the plus 1 actually spurred more repurposing. The short outcome is it didn't. But funny enough, the data had a few surprises. About 40% of drugs that were authorized before the plus 1 came into effect, so from about 1995 to 2006, 40% were repurposed without any extra incentive. And then after it came into effect, well, about 40% were repurposed. It changes around year to year a little, but it goes to show that sort of adding 1 year at least of extra patent-like protection, though not exactly patent-like, didn't actually spur more repurposing. So I know some people have talked about increasing intellectual property incentives and things like that. And at least by this mechanism, there was no noticeable effect.
I wonder if, I don't know if Jonathan is in a position to talk about this in response, but because I don't remember if he was an author on the paper that was recently published about something similar in the UK, I mean, in the US. I know it came out of the Portal Center, and I know Aaron Kesselheim was one of the authors, finding that there was some effect of exclusivity on repurposing, but once the exclusivity period, whatever it was, patent or market exclusivity expired, basically the drug sponsor did absolutely nothing to change the label, didn't try to add any different doses, didn't try to add any different new indications and so on. So I don't know if you were an author to that paper, Jonathan, or if you can speak to that and how that dovetails with John's work.
I was not on that paper, but I mean, there's a lot of different things that could be classified as repurposing, and so I think the incentives are different depending on what you're talking about. One of the simple things that could be done is to provide some type of exclusivity for products that are off patent and have never been developed but might be very effective. And to some extent, this has been done for biologics. We have 12 years in the US of exclusivity, even if you have no patent protection. That's only 5 years for non-biologics. So if 1 year isn't enough, as John described, maybe 5 years is also not enough. So we need to pick out what is the right period, and if repurposing these old, never developed drugs is part of the repurposing that we want to focus on, we could have non-patent exclusivity created. That would be one simple legislative reform that could be considered.
So that's we effectively have that in Europe already. Any drug that goes through the 8.3 pathway receives 8+2, regardless of whether it's new or old. And I've been meaning to evaluate how that works for repurposing, but these studies, they take a long time.
I think one thing that Jonathan's comment brought out for people who are not familiar with the different kinds of protections that drug sponsors can avail themselves of is that certain kinds of drugs are more difficult to protect and make money off of than others. So if a drug has been on the market and had a patent covering it and the patent expires and there's a generic, it becomes difficult to make money off the repurposing because there's not a real way to exclude people from prescribing that drug off label and avoiding the high price that the original patent holder might charge. So one of the things I heard Jonathan say was, well, maybe for repurposing old drugs that have never been developed at all, it might behoove us to have some kind of exclusivity, because in those cases there's only going to be one drug sponsor, and at least until the exclusivity expires. But in other cases, like in a lot of the cases I think NCATS is focused on, at the NCATS meeting, in fact, I think they were focused on off-patent drugs that didn't have an exclusivity. And for that, it seems like it's much trickier, and because you don't have the same ways to exclude competitors. So I wonder if something, going back to the citizens petition, something like that, if that seems like a good potential way to get other non-pharmaceutical firms involved in developing some of this information that we need, either to update the label or to at least start prescribing the drug in a manner that's consistent with the evidence, and toss that back out to the group.
I mean, there's a limited way to exclude competitors after there are multiple generics on the market, and that's the 3-year new clinical trial exclusivity that's available. So that could be strengthened so that it was an exclusivity that prevented other generics from selling the drug at all. But the trade-off would then be that the price of the drug would be much higher. So that's, if there's not enough money to compensate the person who does the original new purpose trial, the way to give them more money is to allow them to charge more. So whether we want to do that depends on whether it's worth the extra cost to get that additional indication on label. Now, there's other ways that you could do this that are probably more complicated. For example, one company could sponsor the additional research, and then any company that wants to hop onto that additional research could pay a prorated portion of it. But that gets pretty complicated pretty quickly.
And then Jonathan, I think you brought this up earlier, is that and others have in our work group, is that what is our end goal, and it just depends, I think, on a variety of different effects. So if you're talking about a generic drug that's maybe 40 years old, and a rare disease population that may have maybe a dozen people that are identified a year, then does it really make sense to go through the expense, the pain, and the time, more than anything, of trying to gather as much of that clinical data, which will always be very difficult because you're always dealing with low numbers, to make any sort of informed regulatory decision? Or do you go about it in a different way? An example of this was given, I think, on our first day of our meeting yesterday, where in rare diseases, a woman whose son had ADNP uses ketamine for that, and has been funding her own trials to be able to do that, and funded a phase 2A trial. And obviously, in order to get through to the FDA, she has to go to a phase 2B and a phase 3, and that's just more money, more time, more effort, when literally there are maybe a couple of dozen kids that have it. So does it really make sense? Is the juice worth the squeeze on that effort? And what is it that we should be doing? It's obviously, we don't want to sell snake oil, so we do want to have some level of effort, but I think that it's also got to be in line with with that, because as you said, if the more development time that's going to be required, then the cost, even though it's a generic, may go up, because somebody's going to have to recoup those costs.
I mean, two other simple solutions are, you could have Congress fund the trial directly through the NIH if you have a specific drug and a specific condition that you're not certain about. or offer a prize in advance. Anyone who provides evidence sufficient for approval for this drug, for this indication, will get this prize.
Yeah, I just jump in because I was on that panel. It was super interesting. One of the things that struck me about the woman who was talking was she's basically like, look, we have 9 people in this trial. Doesn't matter how many people we get, we're never going to get enough to get to statistical significance. And so maybe for diseases like this, we ought to think not about regulatory approval, but evidence gathering. And how do we make sure we get all the possible information that we can get while allowing these kids to get some kind of treatment, and then maybe use that information going forward for some purpose. That's one possible avenue. I don't know if there's some legislative means to kind of differentiate in the way that Marco is talking about between, you know, diseases that have large populations and small populations, sort of like the Orphan Drug Act kind of thing, or some other mechanism we could address rare diseases with.
No, definitely, and Lydia's just commented about the potential of also using public funding to be able to do this. But the other option here is maybe a collaboration with philanthropic funders. You know, I think that rare diseases, especially those that we're talking about here, and obviously the issues where we're talking about repurposed drugs that are, I think that woman has said that it costs $40 a bottle for ketamine, and that gives like 2 months of treatment. That's not going to be, you know, a reimbursement issue. And my concern is that what a lot of companies are doing is going along this sort of repurposing aspect of it. But in order, and this is another aspect that I wanted to talk a little bit about, is the IP part, right? Because people want to say, well, you know, how do you do that? Well, you can reformulate the drug. And once you reformulate it, it's technically not really, you know, there's additional hurdles, first of all, that go onto this, so it tacks on more time. But it also allows you to position yourself as a company to be able to you know, surround yourself with some IP to ensure that you get the reimbursement issues back, you know, into the effort that you put in. And any thoughts about that?
Well, the issue is that if you know, some of those things, if you would do it, you would have to actually do a bit more look at more studies, or you could look at whether for those very small populations at some kind of model driven, you know, a pharmacometric model driven this you know, dosing decision, and looking at those drugs being sort of life cycle regulation. In other words, you know, you do this and you do it one by one, and you know, give us information as it goes along over a period of time. I mean, one of the things I know that FDA has done, which we in Canada don't have the capabilities, but our Institute of Health Research has hooked into some of them, is the registries. The registries is one conduit by which you could maybe think about leveraging a registry to look at those very rare diseases. I mean, it would give you a lot of additional knowledge for another very rare disease that comes along, and not only for that disease, but for another disease as well, in terms of methodology for thinking about what do you do next, or how do you manage the next one.
So I want to follow up on that because I think this raises a really interesting possibility. In the United States, not in the drug world, but in the device world, there are different ways to get to the market depending on the risk of the device. And at the highest level, for the highest risk of the device, you have to go through a pre-market approval process, sort of like, you know, getting a drug approval. If the device has an analog that's existing and on the market, subject to various caveats, and you can show your device is basically the same as that or substantially similar enough, then you can enter the market not subject to the pre-market approval process. And so it raises the question, why couldn't we have something akin to that in the drug context? And why couldn't we, especially for diseases where the population is like 30, why couldn't we have something like this where the central goal is to initially do the kinds of things that Agnes is talking about, kind of like set the framework for maybe some later research, and that's kind of the condition for getting something less than an approval. And maybe that's an avenue. I don't know. I'll throw that back out to the group to see what they think.
I think everybody's talking about, it's really great to engage. It'll be very important to engage the regulators early on. I completely agree. The other challenge here is that it also depends on a little bit of luck on your disease, because different review divisions will have sort of all of their may from the same agency. Some may be more conservative, some may not be quite as conservative, and take that risk. That's another sort of area that that is challenging. But I agree that regardless, earlier discussion with the regulators is going to be key. So I agree with Cesar and others who've asked that. But yeah, Dan, I'm not 100% sure whether others can chime in from the regulatory aspect.
I'll just quickly make a comment. I think that early engagement is really important, because alongside talking about the incentives, I think it's also, which I don't think there is consensus in the field in terms of, what works for every type of marketing authorization or drug company holder. If you go to conferences and you ask industry, you don't get a consistent message actually in terms of what would help assist a company in terms of as an incentive in getting a product to label. But certainly considering the disincentives, I think that's really important, because that's a part of the balance as to whether a company will want to go forward in taking it onto label. And I think there's a couple of things that we should pick up on. I mean, I think about the example about the 9 patients in the clinical trial. It's really important to know, well, actually, how much data do the regulators really need? So you need to come for scientific advice. And often what we hear as regulators is, oh, the regulator wouldn't like it. And then we say, well, did you ask the regulator? And then you get a kind of a tumbleweed moment, and people go, well, no, we didn't. So well, how do you know that the regulator didn't like it? So it's really, honestly, so important to engage with your regulator. I mean, I think there are a number of different ways that you can engage with the regulatory authorities in the different countries across the globe, but it's really important to build that discussion around what kind of data is sort of needed. And I think this is a classic example in COVID, actually, where we saw unprecedented repurposing opportunities, huge amounts of work, but a lot of that work was duplicative, and not all of those studies were high quality. And I think by sort of having that engagement with the regulators could have made a massive difference. And that duplication and repetition is wasteful, and also is a disincentive. And it kind of builds to another point about information sharing and the ability that if information already exists in an innovator company, that those that are developing medicines, such as a not-for-profit, that there is access to that data somehow, so that you're not having to repeat the non-clinical studies if you need to know something about dose finding and all these sort of things. So, I mean, my point is that incentives are incredibly important, and maybe we need to legislate against them. But I think there's also quite a lot we can do to try to smooth the path and remove the barriers and the disincentives. Thank you.
Actually, I agree that early engagement with regulators is because those present the same problems to all the regulators, and in the clusters one can discuss those things and come to some level of consensus, or see why the differences in approaches, and work with those differences to either kind of incorporate them in some way or do something with them, which I've seen in repeated occasions.
Can I comment? Maybe where could regulators work in the way that we would easier facilitate the generation of clinical evidence, so that we would all agree what is the minimal data set that would provide assistance and early scientific advice regarding the data collection, and maybe think of the open software and to offer this to all stakeholders that would like to collect this data. I think we should learned from the COVID-19 crisis, and the recovery data showed us that randomized clinical trials are still the golden standard. So observational trials are not fulfilling the potential, and that's why we need to maybe the regulators should do the pathway for the repurposing, and then we would all have the same approach, because I think we all are striving to make progress in repurposing, but this is not high on the agenda in the industry, and that's why we have so many obstacles to overcome. And I think we need to explore this lack of data collection systems, and issue in legislation definitely needs to be solved about the liability issues, and then I think we'll be fully on board.
I just raised something that Lydia mentioned in the comments, which is how to incentivize academics and clinicians to talk to regulators. I can't speak to clinicians, but as far as academics go, I'll make just two comments about this. One is the way I became involved in this was through research, submitting a FOIA request to FDA, and people at FDA were kind enough to put me in touch with Heather. And so it's not particularly easy for an academic to just kind of waltz into the FDA and start to get engaged. There has to be some connection, which leads me to the second point, which is currently where I am now. There's at Harvard Law School, there's an initiative to try and help solve this problem, try and get academics connected with people in the regulatory world, in the policy world. And I don't know that there's a good answer to this question, but it just takes hard work and determination on the part of an academic to try and get in touch. It might be worth regulatory agencies. I'm going to kindly suggest doing some kind of outreach to academics, or holding some kind of conference or something to get everyone together in a situation like this. I think that might be very helpful, but I'd be interested to hear what other academics and other regulators thought about something like that.
Well, actually, I have to tell you that our academics have no compunction about approaching us with all sorts of things.
Agnes, same with Australia specific. What Simon and Dan and Agnes are saying, that the key driver for repurposing will be that to create a separate section or a branch or whatever you can call that, to be dedicated resource to helping out, because without that dedication on that, because eventually what we see is a health ecosystem gets benefited, and sooner the regulator and reimbursement colleagues start realizing that eventually when you look at the whole life cycle of healthcare management of the patient, it's very important to have this repurposed medication in the life cycle of their patient management. It will help. And also to come back to what next world we're looking at, will be very well connected healthcare system, which will give that information quickly, and real world studies, which we had for last 20-30 years. We're struggling to get the patient level data. Probably that will answer by the new system we're looking at. So hopefully that also will add to having this complete separate resources, which will be dedicated to only repurposing, looking at the academics, the non-profit organizations to help out, to understand where their problems are, how we can as a regulator and reimbursement colleagues come together on the same table and start discussing what are the hurdles and how we can move forward. So I think so there are multiple options on the table to go ahead, but I still feel having a dedicated resource, because as I said, we all know that, I'm at the moment doing this work with you, and in 2 hours time, I need to write a overview on a booster dosing. So we all are stretched into a different direction. So it's not that probably regulatory doesn't have aptitude to reach out to academics, or academics can't reach out. It's just the resource has to be looked into very clearly, and all the regulators as well as reimbursement colleagues have to make this as one of the pivotal healthcare toolkit to improve the patient management. So it could not be just be backpacked on something what we normally do, but have a separate special status in our process.
Let me comment on this. Today and tomorrow we have here in Europe a workshop of a project called STARS, that is how to strengthen the regulatory support to the academics in order to not only for the proposing, but for the idea is to be able to deliver the information that they need. So any development, it doesn't matter whether it is a repurposing or a completely new development, can be continued by the company taking the development from the, and they don't need to start from the scratch. To be honest, I think this is crucial for not only for repurposing, but also for many of the medicine. I mean, we have to think that most of the new developments are in the beginning in the hands of the academic sector, and if we want to streamline the access of patients to medicines, we need to link somehow all the life cycle of the development of a medicine, and to be able to engage with the academics. It is really important. To be honest, I don't know if it's if the academic who has to increment their skill in regulatory, or we as regulators should be open to think in another way when we deal with academics. But definitely this is crucial for the development of new medicines and for the repurposing of all medicines.
I don't mean to pick on Agnes, but what she said was with a with a wry wit that academics are never shy about telling regulators what they ought to do. So what that to me suggests is maybe there's a way to, if academics are trying to engage but they're not doing it in a productive manner, maybe there's a way to engage them in a productive way, so that there could be a collaboration rather than academics just telling you what you ought to do. I don't know if others have experienced that.
Actually, the way that usually happens is that they form consortia actually themselves for research purposes, and they sort of apply for funding. And one of the requirements of their funding quite often is that they get regulatory advice, and so they will come and they will listen to that regulatory advice. I mean, ours is not to be banked; it's given to the best advice that we can give them at the moment. And a lot of things depend on what happens as you do your development pieces. But we always encourage them to communicate at least with us on an ongoing basis to make sure that A, we know that they're not still on the right track, and B, we know that there may be some pitfalls and the project will die. I mean, that's just happened, there is an advantage, I think, to some extent in being what I would call a relatively small regulatory agency that is high visibility overall within the country, because you do have those academic contacts that they can come to you, and they come to you. And with a revamp, our whole kind of science in government, which has happened under the Liberal government over the past years, there's been a very strong independent academic input into kind of policy and so on. To what extent they really listen to all the, all the dotted I's and all the crossed T's is always, you have to mitigate it with the political expedience and the need that, and the sort of overall need. And, that's a difficult transition piece to explain to the public that, you can come and tell us, but we have to take so many other things into account that you end up by having to navigate a middle road of some sort, a kind of a consensus piece. So I think that's another thing that is a very strong communication that one needs to kind of transmit generally to smaller organizations, because otherwise they have expectations that can be fulfilled.
Thanks, Agnes. I also mentioned the participants that are there. We do have the question and answers box. If you have a quick question that you want to ask, we'll be happy to engage with the panel on any questions that you have. So I'll keep an eye on that. I did also want to mention that we've got about 15 minutes left. I knew that this session was going to fly by, and so I just wanted to make everyone aware. David, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I wonder if I could kind of bring the discussion back to where it started with Sandeep. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more for people who are interested in regulatory changes, many of us are curious as to the quantum of time and energy and money that is being spent updating labels in Project Renewal, and whether you think that might be whether that process seems like it might be too cumbersome to deploy in a more widespread manner, or whether you think that some of the things that you learned or are learning during this process could be applied to some kind of legislative or other solution.
Hi, David. Yeah, thanks for that question. Certainly, it is resource intensive on our part. We do work with some external FDA stakeholders as consultants. We have a team at the FDA working on this as well. What we've done is, because we're learning as we go, we haven't gotten these labels out. We're working on them and we keep refining the process over and over to generate process efficiencies. So it does take a lot of time as well. This project started more than a year and a half ago now, and we're still working to just work out the kinks to some degree. So there is that challenge. And though, I don't know, maybe Heather can speak to this better than I, but there is, it might be discussed, the Modern Act to update labels, which this is not a part of. Project Renewal is separate than that, but certainly there's that legislative act that also will help push updating labels as well. But from our standpoint, we're still trying to kind of obtain more resources, get more reviewers, but because, as I kind of mentioned earlier, we're trying to reduce that burden to the company, so we're taking a lot of that on ourselves, I find, so that we'll get them to participate. And that's been kind of really one of the biggest challenges in terms of workload, trying to get this done.
Yeah, so I just a follow-up question. Like approximately how many labels do you anticipate updating out of the universe? I guess the first question is, what is the universe of potential updates? And then how many of those do you anticipate updating?
Yeah, so right now we're concentrating early on older drugs that we know have indications that are just very commonly used throughout the oncology world. So we've looked at or have initiated talks with, or at some stage or another, have looked about 7 or 8 of these. We've essentially completed a review of one. About 2 or 3 others are on the back burner as we await feedback from that first one, so that we can inform how to finish up the others. But those are kind of waiting; they're on deck. And then maybe another 1 or 2 over the next year or 2 is what we're thinking. Some of this is going to depend on, again, if we can get those resources we need. So all in all, I'm hoping, by next year, if we can get 2 or 3 of these done, that would be big. The reason why it's taking so long is because we're working out the legal and regulatory aspects of things. Once those aspects are worked out, the actual literature review, clinical trial data review aspects, I think will flow. That part has been smoothed out considerably. It's all the other aspects and making sure that we have all the clearances we need. Once we have those, the others will, I think, then proceed in an expedited fashion.
That's helpful. So one thing I might suggest, speaking of academics telling regulators what they ought to do, that's not what I'm proposing to do here. But one thing that could be really helpful for someone like me who's looking at how this process is done by private entities is for the FDA to put out kind of, I don't know if it's a guidance document or best practices or however, kind of a summary of the process by which FDA did this. Because right now there's this whole other area, a lot of it happening in oncology, where private entities are evaluating information and that information is being used to make reimbursement decisions. So it would be really, really useful to hear what the FDA thinks is important when they're evaluating labels for updating labels.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. One of my colleagues, he actually wrote a paper before I came onto this project. This was published, I believe, last year, and I can pass that along in the chat in just a moment.
Yeah.
That might be helpful to get an idea of how we've approached some of these things from the start. Now, the process has changed and is still being modified based on the feedback we're getting internally and externally. So at some point, we will, as we get some of these drugs cleared, work to publish some manuscripts on each experience that highlights drug product specific details of how we did it, whatever we can with the taking into account what's proprietary and what's not, so to speak. But I will send this link right now, and this article may actually be a little bit helpful for those of you on the chat here. Get some additional information.
Great, thank you so much. Do you, just like stick with you for one more second, do you think that some of the lessons that you're learning will be applicable to other areas related to the issues we've been discussing, or do you view this as kind of its own discrete entity?
It's a good question. There's some parallels and overlap. I think it's a little bit different. Again, it's not exactly drug repurposing. We're looking at the evidence for drugs that we know have lots and lots of data, and that's a really big difference, I think. We have decades of data. We have pivotal trials. These are in compendia. They're the backbone of chemotherapy regimens that are now being tested in phase 3 trials and as add-on therapies to new contemporary drug approvals. So we have that in our favor, and I think that helps a bit. I think some of the other aspects of drug repurposing may run into some challenges that maybe we don't have as much of because of kind of the space in which we're working.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
So a couple of other things came up, clinical trial costs and ways in which we could, be able to incentivize. I think funding is another aspect of this, and something that I wasn't aware of up until I spoke with Predita. But BPCA, although it's mandated, it doesn't have a funding source beside it. So it's even though Congress says yes, you have to do it, there's no money for it. If that's what I'm taking from that, Predita, is that correct?
That is correct. The money comes from the NIH institutes and centers. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think that this is another aspect of this is funding, because all of this takes money, effort, and sometimes that's not there. So having that be part of it is going to be important. And then I think others have mentioned data sharing. So data sharing, amongst the different regulators, and the challenges of doing that. I guess the other aspect of this is that oftentimes, other than I think Cure ID, most of the aspects that we're talking about here are really within a national program, and we don't really talk about it beyond those borders. But when we think about diseases in general, it is a global issue. So is there an interest to be able to explore that a little bit further, and the potential, first of all, is there interest? Secondly, is it something that we can actually even do based on the current sort of challenges of data privacy and all of that moving forward? That was sort of some of the other thoughts that we had. And I think in the last 5 minutes, I also wanted to ask this group and others, first of all, if they're interested in joining this conversation. This is just an initial sort of discussion that we've had here. There's a lot to unpack, right? There's a lot of different areas that we've identified. And one of the things that we're talking about earlier, David and I, is really starting to focus in and concentrate on these different areas and explore those a little bit further. So I was originally thinking of maybe doing some sort of white paper to be able to focus on this, but there are so many issues here that we really just need to take small bites out of these and write some smaller pieces on each one of those. So, for example, the different diseases that are out there, whether it's a rare disease, how rare is it? Is it an N of 1? Is it related to drug resistance? What is the challenge of that disease? The drugs, whether they're on patent, whether they're off patent, what about shelved assets, things like that, reimbursement issues. We talked a lot about, the potential for academics to come in, others that are typically not in drug development that we would normally think of. Incentives, that's another big area. And then, like I said, sort of this data sharing and trial costs. So that's what I was thinking of exploring a little bit further. But you know, not only just within FDA, but obviously getting groups outside and having a much broader discussion about what it is that is possible, what it is that we can do, and some great ideas that have been generated even by some of these conversations.
I think the data piece is going to be a large one. Before regulators can start collaborating, it seems to me there has to be like a coherent way to get information in a universalizable form. So people are just collecting all kinds of information and not able to harmonize that information in one data set, then it's going to be of very little use. So I think there's definitely some challenges, and those challenges, at least in the United States, this is different probably, and I'd like to hear from some of the regulators there that have nationalized health systems, Canada, Australia, England, or the UK rather. Here, all this information is pretty much gathered by private entities. I mean, there's some information that's generated by the federal government, is reported to the federal government. There's some insurance information that's generated, but it's all kind of all over the place. And there isn't, aside from Medicare claims reporting, payment, that sort of stuff, there isn't really a central database where everything is being collected. So I wonder what's happening on that front in other countries.
Maybe I can mention something that's in the UK. I mean, there is yeah, it's such a buzzword, isn't it? Real world data. I mean, it is really key alongside, you know, the essential data that we need to see from clinical trials. But yeah, we do have, I think, a growing interest in the NHS, the National Health Service, to collect data, particularly thinking about managed access. And we've got an early access to medicine scheme where we're trying to position that in an area where we can collect more real world data before license. And in the ILAP, we're thinking about how we can use capabilities such as our clinical practice research data link, which is a link to data that comes through currently mainly from general practitioners, so it's not secondary care data in hospitals. But I think there are a number of initiatives hopefully going forward that will allow us to be able to collect more data in the real world setting, and perhaps this offsets the uncertainty in terms of the clinical trial data. So maybe that kind of balance in uncertainty of the data, particularly old clinical trials that, you know, have been perhaps done in a different time when the setting was clinical setting was completely different, and it's unlikely that you'll get a new large clinical trial based on the kind of efficacy you've already got. That real world data could be enough to be able to help to get a license going forward.
From what I remember, there was a bit of an uproar years past when the NHS, there was the what was it called? There's some central database that they were going to launch.
Yeah, you have to consider very carefully about consent and data management and sort of the accessibility to the data. So you're right, these are still kind of live discussions about, you know, what data is collected, who owns that data, and how that data might be used. You're absolutely right. These have to be carefully considered when you're thinking framework to collect that data.
Yeah, so it might be one idea is that it might be interesting to get various regulators' perspective on that question, the different issues in each jurisdiction, what they think are important in terms of privacy and consent and ownership and those sorts of issues. So that could be a potential area for collaboration if people are interested.
All right, I see that we're already at the top of the hour, and the 2 hours went by very quick. I think we need to break here. It's been a fantastic discussion. I do want to continue, and we will be continuing this as a work group. and others that are in the participant that want to participate in some of those work groups, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to loop you in and have you work with us to think about some of these efforts moving forward. And so with that, David, do you want to have any last words since you're moderating?
Do I have any last words? That's not good. No, I don't. I want to thank everybody for participating. It's been a really rich discussion, and thanks Marco and Kitty and everybody else at CPATH who's helped to organize this. It was terrific, a lot of fun.
Thanks, everyone.